The orbital bazaar of Kethvar hung in the black of space like a rusted iron moon. It was ugly, it was loud, and it smelled like 1,000 different species crammed into a place built for half that number. Valith Sorn stepped off her shuttle and pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. She was tall, even by Kethvari standards, nearly 8 feet of dark green scales, 4 powerful arms folded beneath the cloak, and a bioluminescent crest on her head that glowed a slow, irritated amber. She hated this place, but she needed what it sold. The bazaar called itself a labor exchange. The rest of the galaxy called it what it was, a slave market with better lighting. Valith moved through the crowds with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. She was a warlord priestess of the Kethvari Dominion, commander of the warship the Pale Doctrine, and she had not come here to browse. She had come here to buy something specific, a personal attendant, someone small, someone quiet, someone who would carry her things, clean her quarters, and never once look her in the eye unless told to. She had lost her last attendant in a docking accident 3 cycles ago. The one before that had tried to poison her. She was tired of strong species with clever ideas. This time, she wanted something weak. Her lieutenant, a stocky Kethvari named Drawl, walked beside her with a datapad. He read the listings aloud as they passed the holding pens. Gorvan male, Tier 4, heavy lifter but aggressive, 2 previous escape attempts. No, Valith said. Palachi female, Tier 6, obedient, good with mechanical work, missing 1 leg. No. They walked deeper into the market. The pens grew smaller and dirtier the further they went. This was where they kept the low-value stock, the species that nobody really wanted. Valith preferred it here, less competition, less noise. What about those? She pointed a clawed finger at a row of small, pale creatures sitting behind an energy barrier. There were 6 of them. They had soft skin, no claws, no armor, no tails. They sat quietly, some staring at the floor, one sleeping against the wall. Drawl checked his datapad. Humans, he said, Tier 9, minimal threat classification. Recently contacted species from a mid-range solar system, endurance-adapted omnivores. He paused and scrolled further. Notes say they are fragile, emotionally unstable, and of negligible combat value. Valith studied them. They looked like something that would break if she squeezed too hard. Perfect. That one, she said. She was pointing at a man sitting apart from the others. He was lean, not large. His hair was dark and cut short. His hands rested on his knees, and she noticed they were rough, the skin thick and lined with old scars. His eyes were gray, and they were open, and they were watching her. Not with fear, not with anger, just watching, like he was memorizing her face. Him, Valith repeated. What is his file? Drawl pulled it up. Corporal Joran Mace, captured during a freight run interception near the border. No listed combat skills. Former occupation listed as, he frowned, manual laborer, no further details. Valith liked that. Manual laborer meant he was used to work. No combat skills meant he would not be a problem. And the way he sat so still, so quiet, he looked like a creature that had already given up. She paid the fee, it was cheap. Humans were cheap. They fitted Joran with a control collar, a thin band of dark metal around his throat that could deliver a shock strong enough to stop his heart if he disobeyed a direct command. He did not fight when they put it on. He did not speak. He simply stood, let them lock it in place, and followed when Valith turned to leave. The walk back to the shuttle dock was long. Valith did not look at him. Drawl kept glancing back, more out of curiosity than concern. He is very quiet, Drawl said. Good, Valith replied. Most new ones scream or beg. Then most new ones are annoying. This one is not. That is why I chose him. They boarded the shuttle. Joran was placed in the rear compartment, separated from them by a metal grate. As the shuttle lifted off and angled toward the Pale Doctrine, Valith glanced through the grate once. Joran was not looking at her. He was looking at the shuttle walls. His eyes moved slowly from panel to panel, bolt to bolt, seam to seam. His fingers rested lightly against the metal floor, and his head was tilted just slightly to one side, as if he was listening to something she could not hear. She dismissed it and turned away. The Pale Doctrine was a Kethvari heavy cruiser, long, dark, and covered in ceremonial etchings that told the history of Valeth's bloodline. It held a crew of 300 warriors, a full weapons bay, and a forged temple deep in its belly where the sacred blades of the priesthood were made. It was not a kind ship. It was not meant to be. Joran was taken to a small cell on the lower decks. The room had a thin mat, a water tap, and nothing else. A guard shoved him inside, and the door slid shut with a heavy clang. He stood alone in the dark. For a long moment he did not move. He simply breathed, in and out, slow, steady. Then he reached out and placed his hand flat against the metal wall. He pressed his palm into it, feeling the cold, feeling the grain of the alloy beneath the paint. He curled his fingers and tapped once, twice with his knuckle. A small, clear note rang out in the silence. He listened to it fade. He knew that sound. He had grown up with that sound. His father's workshop back on Earth had been full of that sound, the ring of metal answering a question only a smith could ask. What are you made of? What can you become? Joran closed his eyes. The ship around him was enormous, armed and full of creatures that could tear him apart with their bare hands. He was collared, locked in a box, and 10,000 light years from home. But the walls were iron. The bones of this ship were iron. And iron, no matter who shaped it or where it flew, always remembered the hammer. He opened his eyes in the dark, and for the first time since his capture, quietly, so no one could see, Joran Mace smiled. 3 weeks passed aboard the Pale Doctrine, and Joran Mace became invisible. That was the idea. He woke before the ship's lights came on. He cleaned Valeth's quarters before she rose. He carried her armor to the polishing bay, scrubbed the corridors outside her chambers, fetched her meals from the galley, and stood in the corner like furniture when she held meetings with her officers. He never spoke unless asked a question. He never looked anyone in the eye. He moved like a shadow with calloused hands. The crew noticed him the way one might notice a stain on the wall, with mild disgust and no real interest. They called him Salrit, which meant soft meat. It was not a name. It was a reminder of what they believed he was. A Kethvari warrior named Torek made a game of it. Every time he passed Joran in the corridor, he would shove him into the wall, not hard enough to break bones, but hard enough to leave bruises. Torek was 9 feet tall and had arms like tree trunks. He laughed every time Joran stumbled. Joran never reacted. He picked himself up, straightened whatever he was carrying, and kept walking. "It does not even flinch," Torek said to his friends one evening, loud enough for the whole deck to hear. "I have seen insects with more fight." The laughter carried through the metal halls. Joran heard it from his cell. He sat on his thin mat, rolling a small piece of scrap metal between his fingers, a bolt he had found on the cargo deck, and he said nothing. But he was learning. Every day he learned more of their language. The Kethvari spoke in deep, rumbling tones, and their words were built from sounds that a human throat was not designed to make. But Joran listened with the patience of a man who had spent years listening to metal cool, slowly, carefully, hearing the tiny shifts that told him if the steel was settling right. Language was no different. It was just another material to study. By the end of the 2nd week, he understood most of what the crew said around him. By the 3rd week, he could follow full conversations. He never let them know. He also watched their combat drills. Every 3 days, Valeth's warriors trained in the ship's main hold, a wide, echoing space with scratched floors and weapon racks along the walls. They fought with long, curved blades called Velkari, sacred weapons forged in the ship's own temple. The drills were loud, fast, and brutal. The Kethvari fought with all 4 arms, spinning their blades in patterns that looked like storms made of steel. Joran was ordered to mop the hold after each session. He did so slowly, very slowly, and while he mopped, he watched the weapon racks. He studied the way the warriors gripped their blades. He memorized their footwork, where they planted their weight, where they left themselves open. They were strong and fast, but they fought the same way every time. The same patterns, the same angles. They had never needed to adapt. Nothing in the galaxy had ever pushed them to. On the 18th day, Valeth decided to test him. She was bored. The ship was in transit, the stars outside were dull, and she had read every report on her desk twice. She summoned Joran to the cargo bay and pointed at a freight pallet loaded with engine parts. It weighed roughly 300 kilograms by Earth standards. "Hold it," she said, "above your head. Do not put it down until I say." Draal, standing behind her, raised a brow. "He will collapse in minutes." "Then I will know his limit," Valeth said. She settled into a chair someone had brought for her and folded two of her arms. "Begin." Joran looked at the pallet. He did not argue. He bent his knees, gripped the edges, and lifted. It was heavy. It was immediately, violently heavy. His arms screamed. His spine compressed. His vision blurred at the edges as blood rushed to his muscles and away from everything else. He held it. 1 hour passed. His shoulders shook. Sweat ran down his face and dripped from his chin in a steady stream. The Kethvari who had gathered to watch were quiet now. 2 hours. His breathing turned ragged. A blood vessel burst in his left eye, turning the white bright red. He did not put the pallet down. 3 hours. Draal stood up from where he was sitting. "This is not possible," he said quietly. "His species is Tier 9. Valeth said nothing. She was leaning forward in her chair, her crest shifting through colors she could not control, gold to orange to something close to white. 4 hours. Joran's nose began to bleed. His arms had stopped shaking, which was worse. It meant the muscles had gone past trembling into some deeper place where the body simply refused to quit. His face was pale. His gray eyes were glassy, but they were open, and they were locked on Valeth. "Stop," she said. He lowered the pallet. It hit the deck with a boom that echoed through the bay. Joran stood swaying, blood on his lip, his arms hanging like dead weight at his sides. No one laughed. Torek, who had come to watch, was standing with his mouth slightly open. Valeth rose from her chair and walked toward Joran. She stopped in front of him and looked down. He was less than 2/3 her height. "What were you before you were captured?" she asked. Joran wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his hand. "A blacksmith's son," he said. His voice was hoarse and quiet but steady. Valeth blinked. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound. On her world, the forge was sacred. Only the priesthood was allowed to touch the hammer and the anvil. The idea that this small, bleeding creature had any connection to metalwork was the funniest thing she had heard in years. "A blacksmith," she repeated, still laughing. "Your kind can barely stand upright for 4 hours and you claim to know the forge." Joran did not answer. He let her laugh. He let them all laugh. That night, when the ship was dark and the crew was asleep, Joran made his way to the deepest cargo hold, a forgotten space behind the engine room where broken parts and scrap metal were dumped to be recycled later. He had found it on his 6th day aboard and had been visiting it every night since. He knelt on the cold floor and pulled out the pieces he had been hiding beneath a dead ventilation panel, scraps of hull iron. A cracked heating element that still worked if he wired it a certain way. A chunk of ballast metal he had pried from a damaged strut. His tools were primitive. A flat piece of deck plating for an anvil, a heavy coupling joint for a hammer, the heating element for a forge. It was nothing like his father's workshop. It was dark, cramped, and he had to work in silence. But his hands knew what to do. They had always known. He heated the iron. He folded it. He hammered it, soft, careful blows, muffled by a rag wrapped around the coupling joint. Each strike sent a tiny ring through the metal, a sound so faint that only he could hear it. He was not building a weapon, not yet. He was learning this metal, its temper, its grain, the way it liked to bend and where it wanted to break. Every alloy was different. Every metal had a voice, and Joran Mace had been trained since childhood to listen. The ship flew on through the dark between stars. 300 Kethvari warriors slept in their bunks, dreaming of conquest and glory. Below them, in a forgotten corner of their own ship, a human sat cross-legged on the floor with iron in his hands and fire in his eyes, and he shaped the dark into something patient, something waiting, something with an edge. The attack came without warning. The Pale Doctrine had entered the Veshan corridor, a narrow stretch of patrolled space between two Kethvari territories. It was supposed to be safe. It was not. Joran was in the galley, carrying a tray of food to Valeth's quarters when the first explosion tore through the ship. The floor bucked beneath his feet and threw him into the wall. The tray flew from his hands and shattered against the ceiling. Lights flickered. Alarms screamed. A second explosion hit, and this one was closer. Joran felt the hull shudder like a living thing in pain. He grabbed a support beam and held on as the ship rocked sideways. Through the walls, he heard the deep, grinding sound of metal being cut, not from the inside, but from the outside. Someone was cutting their way in. On the command deck, Valeth was already on her feet. Her crest blazed red, the color of war. Draal was beside her, reading damage reports as fast as they came in. 3 breach points, Draal said. Lower decks, midsection, and cargo bay. They are Vrathan. Valeth's jaw tightened. The Vrathan Warklins were a rival faction of Kethvari, bigger, crueler, and famous for one thing above all else. They took no prisoners. They boarded ships, killed the crew, and stripped the hulls for scrap. It was not war to them. It was sport. How many? Valeth asked. Scans show 900. We have 300. 3-1. Bad odds even for her crew. Seal the forge temple, she ordered. Arm everyone. Hold the command deck at all cost. The fighting began within minutes. Vrathan warriors poured through the hull breaches like a flood, massive, armored, their 4 arms carrying heavy blades and plasma cutters. Valeth's crew met them in the corridors, and the ship filled with the sounds of steel on steel, screaming, and the wet crack of bodies hitting walls. Joran pressed himself flat against the galley wall as a squad of Vrathan stormed past. They did not see him. To them he was furniture, a tiny, soft thing not worth a second glance. He waited until they passed, then moved. He did not run for the escape pods. He knew where they were. He had memorized their location on his second day aboard, but he did not go to them. He went down. The lower decks were chaos. Smoke filled the corridors. Bodies lay on the floor, Kethvari from both sides, tangled together in death. The emergency lights cast everything in a dim red glow. Joran stepped over the fallen and kept moving, his bare feet silent on the metal floor. A stray plasma bolt hit the wall beside his head. He flinched but did not stop. A moment later, a second bolt struck his collar. The device sparked, crackled, and went dead. The light on it blinked once and faded. The collar was broken. He was free. He did not slow down. He did not celebrate. He ran faster. The cargo hold was empty when he reached it. The fighting had not come this far down yet. He dropped to his knees beside the dead ventilation panel and pulled out what he had been building. It was a blade. 22 inches of folded hull iron, shaped over weeks of silent, secret work. The edge was not perfect. The surface was rough, marked with tiny hammer strikes he had not been able to polish away. By Kethvari standards, it was ugly, a crude thing with no ceremonial etching, no sacred blessing, no history. But it was balanced. He had spent 3 nights getting the balance right, shifting weight grain by grain until the blade sat in his hand like it had grown there. And it was sharp. He had ground the edge on the cargo bay floor until it could split a thread dropped across it. It was not a Kethvari blade. It was not meant to be. It was a human blade. Forged the old way, the way his father had taught him in a workshop that smelled like coal and rain. Folded and hammered like the smiths of ancient Earth had done, the same method, the same patience, the same love for the work. Joran wrapped his hand around the grip. The metal was cold, and then it was warm, and then it was part of him. He stood, he climbed. The command deck was 3 levels up, by the time he reached it. The battle had turned badly for Valith. Her warriors fought with everything they had, but the Vrathan kept coming. The corridors were slick with blood. The air tasted like copper and smoke. Joran moved through the edges of the fighting, staying low, staying small. Twice, Vrathan warriors saw him and dismissed him. He was a tiny, unarmed-looking creature in servant's clothes, not worth the effort. The third one who saw him did not dismiss him. A Vrathan scout blocked his path in a narrow corridor, grinning down at him with teeth like broken glass. The scout raised a heavy blade. Joran did not wait. He stepped inside the scout's reach, closer than the alien expected, closer than any sane creature would go, and drove his blade upward through the gap between the chest plates. The Vrathan made a sound like air escaping a balloon and collapsed. Joran pulled the blade free, wiped it on his sleeve, and kept moving. He reached the command deck door. It was dented from the outside. Through the metal he could hear fighting, the clash of blades, Valith's voice shouting orders, and beneath it all, the deep, rumbling laugh of someone very large. He opened the door. The command deck was a ruin. Consoles were smashed. Sparks fell from the ceiling like rain. Bodies littered the floor. Half of Valith's personal guard was dead. The other half was backed into a corner, bleeding, exhausted, holding a line that was about to break. And in the center of the room stood Korath. The Vrathan champion was enormous, 10 feet of black-scaled muscle and scarred armor. He held a Velkari blade in each of his 4 hands, and every one of them was stained dark with blood. His crest burned a deep, furious crimson. He was smiling. Valith was on the floor before him. 2 of her 4 arms hung at wrong angles, broken. She had pulled herself up onto one knee, her remaining arms gripping a shattered blade, her crest flickering between red and the pale gray of someone close to death. She was beaten, and she knew it, and she refused to close her eyes. Korath raised his primary blade. The killing stroke, a downward cut aimed at the crest. Among the Kethvari, taking the crest meant taking the soul. "Your bloodline ends here, priestess," he said. The command deck door creaked. Korath turned. Joran stood in the doorway. He was small. He was covered in grime and someone else's blood. He wore no armor. He carried a single blade, rough, ugly, and singing faintly as air moved across its edge. Korath stared at him. Then he laughed. The sound was like boulders grinding together. "Asalrit," Korath said, "you send your soft meat to save you, priestess. This is your last champion." Valith from the floor looked at Joran with wide eyes. She opened her mouth to say something, run, perhaps, or go, or you fool. Joran did not look at her. He looked at Korath. His gray eyes were steady, and inside them there was something that the Vrathan champion had never seen in a Tier 9 species before. It was not fear, it was not anger, it was certainty. Joran shifted his weight. He set his feet, left foot forward, right foot back, knees bent, exactly the way his father had shown him in a muddy workshop on a planet none of these creatures had ever heard of. He raised his blade. It caught the red emergency light and threw a line of brightness across the ruined deck. Korath stopped laughing. Something in the human stance was wrong, not wrong as in broken, wrong as in familiar. The way the blade sat in his hand, the way his weight settled, the way his eyes locked on and did not waver. Korath had fought 1,000 enemies across 100 worlds. He had never seen anything fight exactly like this. But some deep, old part of his brain recognized it, recognized the look of a creature that had been built, generation after generation, for exactly this moment. The blade sang. Not a Kethvari song. Something older. Something low and steady and human. A sound that had echoed in forges and battlefields on a small blue world for 10,000 years before any Kethvari had ever looked at the stars. Joran moved. Korath's laugh died in his throat, along with everything else. 6 strikes, that was all it took. The first cut opened Korath's lead arm at the wrist. Not a wild swing, a precise, angled slice that followed the gap between the armor plates. The blade moved so fast that Korath did not feel it until his fingers stopped working and his weapon clattered to the floor. The champion roared and swung with his remaining 3 arms. 3 blades came at Joran from 3 different angles, a killing pattern that had ended 1,000 fights before this one. Joran was not there. He had already moved, not backward the way any sane creature would retreat from a 4-armed giant. He moved forward inside the arc of the blades, so close that Korath's own arms got in each other's way. The second strike took Korath across the back of his left knee. The giant stumbled. The third strike hit the elbow of his upper right arm. Another blade fell. Korath snarled and lashed out with raw strength, swinging his remaining good arm in a wide, desperate sweep. It was fast. Joran caught the edge of it across his ribs. The pain was white and immediate. He felt something crack, felt the hot rush of blood soaking through his shirt. He did not stop. Strike 4 opened a line across Korath's throat armor, not deep enough to kill but deep enough to bleed. Strike 5 severed the tendons in his last fighting arm. Korath's final blade hit the floor with a sound like a funeral bell. The champion stood swaying, disarmed, bleeding from 4 wounds. He was still alive. He was still enormous. And in his yellow eyes, for the first time in his long and violent life, there was something that looked like confusion. He did not understand what had just happened. He had fought species stronger than humans, faster than humans, larger than humans. None of them had moved like this. None of them had dismantled him so calmly, so efficiently, like a craftsman taking apart a machine he had studied for weeks. And that was exactly what Joran had done. Every combat drill he had watched while mopping the training hold, every pattern he had memorized, every opening he had cataloged in the Kethvari fighting style, wide swings, over-reliance on upper arms, poor defense of the lower joints. He had learned them all quietly, patiently, the way he learned everything, by watching, by listening, by waiting. Strike 6 was clean, across the throat below the armor line. Korath fell like a tower and the deck shook when he hit the floor. Silence filled the command deck. The surviving Kethvari warriors stared at the small human standing over their enemy's champion. Blood ran down Joran's side. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. The cracked rib was pressing against something it should not press against. His vision was narrowing at the edges. But he was standing, and Korath was not. Joran turned to the warriors. They looked at him with wide, amber eyes. He did not try to speak their language, not yet. He simply raised his blade, pointed it toward the corridor where the sounds of fighting still echoed, and walked toward it. He did not order them to follow. He did not ask. He just went. Draal was the first to move. The stocky lieutenant picked up a fallen blade, looked at Valeth, who was watching from the floor with an expression that had no name in any language, and followed the human out the door. The others followed after that, not because they trusted him, not because they respected him, but because the Vrathan champion was dead on the floor and the creature who had killed him was walking toward the enemy, and some part of their warrior brains could not let a Salrit lead the charge alone. What followed was not a battle, it was a turning point. Joran moved through the ship's corridors with the Kethvari warriors behind him. He did not fight like them. They swung their blades in great, sweeping arcs. He used short, tight movements, economical, precise, designed for narrow spaces and close quarters. Where they relied on strength, he relied on timing. Where they fought with fury, he fought with geometry. The Vrathan did not know what to make of him. They had expected the crew of the Pale Doctrine to be broken by now. Instead, they found a ragged counterattack led by a creature half their size, moving through the corridors like water through a cracked dam, finding every gap, exploiting every mistake. At a junction near the engine room, a Vrathan officer cornered Joran and swung a heavy plasma cutter at his head. Joran ducked, stepped to the side, and opened the officer's arm from wrist to elbow. When the alien dropped the cutter, Joran kicked it across the floor to a wounded Kethvari warrior who had lost her weapon. She picked it up, stared at him for one frozen second, and then fought beside him. That was how it went, deck by deck. Joran did not conquer the ship alone. He was one man with one blade and a body that was breaking down with every step. But he was the point of the spear, and behind him, the crew of the Pale Doctrine remembered what they were. The final breach point was the cargo bay, the same cargo bay where Joran had forged his blade in secret. 20 Vrathan held it, using the heavy freight containers as cover. Joran looked at the layout, looked at the Kethvari warriors gathered behind him, and spoke for the first time since the fighting began. He spoke in Kethvari. His accent was terrible, his grammar was broken, but the words were clear. Left side 4 warriors, right side 4 warriors, push them to the center. I will go through the middle. Draal stared at him. You speak our language. Enough, Joran said. Go now. They went. The cargo bay fight lasted 3 minutes. The Vrathan, compressed into the center by the flanking groups, found themselves facing a human who had spent weeks studying exactly how they moved and exactly where their armor failed. 3 minutes, and it was over. When the last Vrathan fell, Joran lowered his blade. His arm was shaking. His shirt was soaked through with blood, some his, most not. The cracked rib had become something worse. Every breath was a knife in his chest. His left eye was swelling shut from a blow he did not remember taking. He made it 2 steps toward the wall before his legs gave out. He hit the deck hard. The blade slipped from his fingers and rang against the metal floor, one clear, bright note that echoed through the silent cargo bay. Valith found him there. She had dragged herself from the command deck with her 2 working arms, trailing blood behind her, refusing help from anyone. She crawled across the cargo bay floor and stopped beside the fallen human. He was still breathing, barely. His eyes were half open, unfocused, staring at nothing. She reached down and picked up his blade. She held it the way a priestess holds a sacred thing, gently, with reverence, turning it in the light. The metal was rough. The edge was imperfect. There were no ceremonial markings, no blessed symbols, no history etched into the steel. But the fold lines were there. Faint, uneven, but unmistakable. Layer after layer of metal, heated and folded and hammered together. The ancient method. The hard way. The way the first Kethvari smiths had worked before machines and factories and mass production made the old techniques unnecessary. Her people had nearly forgotten that method. It was taught in the forged temples as history, not practice. No living Kethvari smith worked this way anymore. And this human, this Tier 9, this soft meat, this creature she had bought for the price of a meal, had done it in secret, in the dark, with scrap metal and a broken heating element on her own ship. Valith looked at the blade, and then she looked at Joran, and her crest did something it had never done in all her years of war and command and prayer. It dimmed to white, the color of reverence, the color the old text said a priestess should show only before the forge fire itself. How, she whispered, how does a Tier 9 know the old way? Joran's eyes focused, just barely. He looked up at her, this towering, scaled creature who had bought him, collared him, made him hold a weight above his head for 4 hours just to see when he would break. Every human world, he said, his voice barely a sound, has an old way. He coughed, blood flecked his lips. We never forgot. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed, but his hand, lying on the cold metal floor beside his blade, did not relax. Even unconscious, his fingers stayed curled, as if holding something only he could feel. The shape of a hammer, the memory of fire, the old way carried in human hands across 10,000 years and 10,000 light years, still burning in the dark. The Kethvari homeworld had no name that translated into any other language. The Kethvari simply called it the ground, the first ground, the only ground that mattered. Everything else was just space they had claimed. Joran saw it through the medical bay window as the pale doctrine limped into orbit. It was a dark planet, volcanic, veined with rivers of red light that glowed even from space. It looked like a world that had been forged rather than born. He was sitting upright for the first time in 6 days. The ship's medical officer, a stern Kethvari female who had treated his wounds with supplies meant for animals, since the ship carried no human medicine, had told him that by all reasonable science, he should be dead. The punctured lung alone should have killed him. The blood loss should have killed him before that. "Your species," she had said, scanning him with something between frustration and fascination, "does not know when to stop functioning." Joran had said nothing. He had simply asked for water and gone back to watching the stars. Now Valith stood beside him, her broken arms sealed in healing casts that hummed with a low vibration. Her crest was a calm blue, the color of deep thought. She had been quiet for most of the journey home. She had visited him in the medical bay every day, but she rarely spoke. She would sit across from him, study his face, and leave. Something had changed in her. Joran could see it. The way she looked at him was different from the way she looked at anything else. Not with ownership, not with pity, but with something careful and searching, like a smith examining a piece of metal she did not yet understand. "I am taking you before the Crest Council," she said. Joran turned his head. "What is that?" "The highest authority in the Dominion, the warrior priesthood. They rule from the Hall of Crests beneath the mountain. No alien has ever entered it." "Then why take me?" Valith was quiet for a moment. "Because what you did cannot be ignored, and because there is an old law, older than the Dominion itself, that says the forge speaks louder than blood." She reached into the folds of her cloak and produced his blade. She had carried it since the battle. It was clean now, the rough metal catching the light from the volcanic planet below. "This is real," she said, "ugly, imperfect, but real, forged by hand, folded by hand in the old way. The law says that any being who forges a true blade and draws blood in defense of a Kethvari vessel can claim Valshar Koreth Ironkin, not property, not alien, kin." Joran looked at the blade in her hands. "And the council will accept this. Half will want to kill you for touching sacred metal. The other half," she paused. "I do not know what the other half will do. This has never happened before." The Hall of Crests was carved into the heart of a volcanic mountain. The walls were black stone, polished smooth, and they glowed with veins of molten rock that pulsed like a heartbeat. The ceiling was lost in shadow. The floor was iron, real iron, unalloyed, the same metal the first Kethvari had pulled from the ground 100,000 years ago. Joran walked across it barefoot. Valith had told him this was required. The iron must feel the one who walks upon it. The council sat in a half-circle of stone thrones. 12 priestesses, each one ancient, enormous, and radiating the kind of authority that came from centuries of unchallenged power. Their crests glowed in slow, shifting patterns, reading Joran, judging him, the way their species had always judged everything, by what they felt, not what they saw. The hall was silent, except for the deep pulse of the mountain's heart. Valith spoke first. She stood at the center of the floor, her healing arms stiff at her sides, and told the full account. The ambush, the breach, the fighting, and the human who had forged a blade from her ship's own iron and killed the Vrathan champion with 6 strikes. When she finished, she placed Joran's blade on the iron floor. The sound it made, metal on metal, rang through the hall like a bell. The council erupted. "Blasphemy! The word came from a priestess on the far left, a massive, scarred warrior with a crest that burned red. A Tier 9 creature touched the sacred metal. It entered a forged space. It shaped iron without blessing, without training, without right. This is not valor. This is violation. The blade is real, Valeth said. The law does not ask who forged it, only whether it was forged true. The law was written for us, another counselor hissed, not for soft-skinned animals from backwater worlds. The argument went back and forth. Voices rose, crests flared. Joran stood in the center of it and said nothing. He had learned enough about the Kethvari to know that interrupting their priestesses was the fastest way to die in this room. Finally, the eldest spoke. She sat at the center of the half-circle. She was old, impossibly old, her scales faded to a dusty gray. Her crest white and dim, her eyes were clouded, she was blind, but when she spoke, every other voice in the hall went silent. "Bring me the blade," she said. Valeth carried it to her and placed it in her hands. The old priestess held it the way a mother holds a child, gently, knowingly. She ran her fingers along the flat of the blade, feeling the surface, the tiny hammer marks, the fold lines pressed into the metal. She held it for a long time. The hall waited. "The fold is uneven," she said at last. "The edge is rough. The balance is imperfect by a fraction." The scarred priestess smiled in triumph. "But the iron is true," the old one continued. "It was heated with patience. It was folded with knowledge. It was hammered by hands that understood what they held." She lifted her blind face toward Joran. "The steel remembers the one who shaped it, and this steel says the hands were worthy." The hall was silent. "Let the creature speak," the eldest said. Joran stepped forward. He looked at the 12 most powerful beings in the Kethvari dominion and opened his mouth, and he spoke in their language, imperfect, accented, clear. "I am not your enemy," he said. "I did not forge that blade to insult your traditions. I forged it because it was the only thing I knew how to do." He paused. The words came slowly, not because he did not know them, but because he wanted each one to land. "On my world we have 1,000 ways to shape metal, 1,000 traditions passed from hand to hand across generations. Damascus steel, Tamahagan, Woots, Bloomery iron, each one born from a different people, a different land, a different need, but all of them born from the same truth that a thinking creature with fire and patience can take raw stone and turn it into something that sings." He looked at the blade in the old priestess's hands. "Your people call mine Tier 9, soft, weak, no claws, no armor, no venom. And you are right, we have none of those things, but we have hands, and we have time, and we have 10,000 years of learning what our hands can do when we refuse to stop." He let the words settle. Then he said the last part quietly, without pride, without challenge, just truth. "We are not soft. We are what happens when a soft species looks at the universe and decides that it will make its own claws." The hall was still. The eldest priestess turned the blade over once more in her ancient hands. Then she set it down on the iron floor, and it rang again, that same clear note, echoing off the black stone walls and up into the shadowed ceiling. "True," she said. The vote was not unanimous. 4 counselors voted against, but 8 voted in favor, and 8 was enough. Joran Mace was granted Valshar status, Ironkin of the Kethvari dominion. His slave collar was brought before the council, and the eldest ordered it melted. The metal was reforged by Valeth herself, in the hall's own forge, into a small crest pin shaped like a hammer crossed with a Kethvari blade. Valeth affixed it to his shoulder. Her hands were still healing and her grip was clumsy. Joran steadied her wrist without a word, and for a moment they stood like that, the priestess and the blacksmith's son, eye to eye for the first time as equals. 3 weeks later, the Kethvari Dominion filed a formal challenge to the Galactic Species Database. The entry for Homo sapiens was flagged for reclassification. The proposed new entry read, Tier 2, Adaptive Apex Persistence Predator. Extreme threat. Do not underestimate, do not enslave. They remember what their hands are for. On the day the filing went through, Joran stood at the viewport of the Pale Doctrine, watching the stars. The ship was repaired. His ribs were healed. The crest pin on his shoulder caught the light of a distant sun. Valith came to stand beside him. She did not stand behind him, and he did not stand behind her. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, or as close to shoulder as an 8-foot scaled priestess and a 5'10" human could manage. "Where do you want to go?" she asked. Joran watched the stars. Somewhere out there, past the trade routes and the contested borders and the species that had never heard of Earth, his home was turning slowly in the light of a yellow sun. His father's workshop was probably still standing, the anvil cold, the forge dark, waiting. "Home," he said, "first." Valith nodded. "And then?" she asked. Joran looked at her. For the first time since she had known him, something in his gray eyes shifted. Not warmth exactly, not softness. Something deeper, the look of a man who had found his purpose in the dark and carried it into the light. "Back," he said, "there is a lot more steel to sing." Valith's crest glowed white. She said nothing. She did not need to. The Pale Doctrine turned toward the stars, and the human and the priestess stood together at the window, watching the dark fill with light, and somewhere in the belly of the ship, in a forge that now bore both Kethvari symbols and a single human hammer mark on its door, a piece of iron sat cooling on an anvil. It was waiting, the way iron always waits. Patient, ready, remembering the hands that shaped it.